everyone. Again, my name is Wayne Lindwall. I'm on the Agri-Cluster Committee for this New Generation Exchange program, and happy to be your facilitator for, well, this afternoon, I guess this evening, in the case of our friends from South America. But I'm very pleased to be hosting this. We'll get started. It is being recorded. I would like to introduce our speaker for session 2 this evening or this afternoon, Rob Dunn, who I've had the pleasure of knowing for over 30 years, I guess, Rob, who's counting at our age, I guess. But in any case, Rob is a professional agrologist. We talked a bit on Monday about private consultants and public consultants, but Rob is now a professional agrologist and consultant of his own company with his wife, Anne, managing FarmWise, and they provide research and cropping system expertise to farm and industry clients for the last several years, since 2015. Prior to starting his own business, Rob was working for Alberta Agriculture in terms of extension. He had various roles in cropping systems and advising on soil management and land use. He's also worked extensively internationally on various projects in terms of agronomic support on irrigation and dryland development in Mongolia between 2002 and 2006. And he's also worked in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Russia, providing conservation cropping system extension support between 2007 and 2012. In 2016, he visited Brazil and learning about irrigation management programs delivered by Irriger, a Brazilian irrigation management service provider. Today, we're happy to have Rob talk about some of the fundamentals of soils and climate in Alberta, because it provides a great foundation for what sessions we have coming over the next 5 weeks. And obviously with Rob's experience and internationally and domestically, he's in a great position to share that with us. So welcome, Rob, and I'll turn the session over to you. But before doing that, I'll just remind everyone to keep their microphones off during the presentation. If you feel the need to ask a question or to want Rob to maybe slow down, don't hesitate to put your hand up and we'll slow down a bit, but you'll have lots of opportunity to ask Rob questions at the end of the presentation. So take it away, Rob.
Thanks very much, Wayne. So Wayne, when I first came down to Lethbridge in 1989, actually, Wayne was kind of sort of almost at the tail end of his career of kind of introducing no-till crop production and many other things as an ag engineer in Southern Alberta. So he was definitely a mentor for me and really for many of the farmers that I ended up working with. And Wayne did the heavy lifting. And I was able to come along when we started introducing, or I guess call it the inception of no-till farming on the Northern Great Plains. And I got to get all the glory, but Wayne did the heavy lifting and the slogging in those years leading up to the late 80s. But so it's a real pleasure to be here with you today. And some of the things I'm going to cover here today is we're going to talk about as an overview of Alberta's arable land base and the crops that we grow. And that'll be kind of a bit of a quick overview just to give you a sense. And I know that some of that will be a little bit of an overlap perhaps with the presentation that you had on Monday. But what I'm going to focus mostly on is the second and third points here, and that is the landscapes and the soils that we have in our prairie provinces, and more specifically to Alberta. And we're going to go right back to the Ice Age, to kind of explain a little bit about the kind of landscapes that we have that were shaped through the Ice Age. And in the 10 or 12,000 years since then. So we'll also just go on a virtual soils tour, showing you some of the major soil types that we have on the prairies in Southern Alberta, or in Alberta, I guess, more specifically again. And then we'll talk about the Canada's land suitability rating system and tie that back to some of the typical kind of crop yields that you'd expect on the prairies. And so with that, I did want to say, as Wayne mentioned, that I had this incredible opportunity in January of 2016 to travel down, and I spent some time in the state of Goiás. It was in the community of Paracatu, for those of the folks that are from Brazil. And I was working with Irrigation, who is a company that had a reciprocal relationship with a company called Farmer's Edge up here on the, which Farmer's Edge is an international company, as well as Irrigation is an international company that offers irrigation management expertise. And so here, just a picture of a no-till soybean coming up in late January on some no-till. What was really incredible is that throughout my career, which started in 1980, we knew and we heard about that Cerrado region of Brazil, and just what an incredible difference that was going to make to world food production, and just the ability through the science that had been applied in that area to be able to transform those soils, which were, back in the 50s and 60s, I think that there was just a feeling that because of the incredible acidity and challenges that, okay, that's going to be native grazing, but through the work of the universities and specialists, they were able to transform that land. And of course, lime was a big part of that. But every field I visited down there had a lime, well, every second or third field, because they apply lime so often down there. It was a incredible trip. And when I just contrasting the soils, well, yeah, we did have some fun. I did have some fun down there, and it was nothing like coconut water right out of a coconut. But yeah, the soils down there are just incredible in terms of the differences, and we'll maybe touch a little bit on this in terms of contrasting, at least the soils that I encountered in that area. This was about a 5% organic matter soil with about 60% clay, and anything here with that much clay, it had been sticking to our boots, but we were out in the field checking for moisture here. But again, that's kind of my limited experience in North America. Most of the rest of my work has been in the temperate regions of the Northern Hemisphere, and particularly I've been working up here on our the northern Great Plains of the northern U.S. and Canada. So let's talk about the arable land base in Canada, just to kind of get started. And incredible land mass in Canada, but only 6.5% of it is arable. We have about 40 million hectares of arable land in Canada. Now, most of that is in the western part of Canada, in the prairie provinces. So our prairie provinces, which would be the province of Alberta on your left, and then in the center, the province of Saskatchewan, and then the province of Manitoba. Again, I think most of you will be kind of familiar with this from last Monday's presentation, but the prairie provinces do have 85% of Canada's arable land. And for our presentation here today, I'm going to be focusing a bit more specifically on our Alberta land base. But really, when you look at that center province there of Saskatchewan on the prairies, it's the province with the greatest arable land base. And it's when you're hearing about conservation farming technology, or just farming in general, in reference to Western Canada, often the stories coming out of places like Saskatchewan, and University of Saskatchewan is an incredibly important university for crop production, agronomy, and conservation. So that's a place that you'll want to visit if you're ever up in this part of the world, is obviously University Saskatchewan, and University of Alberta, of course, as well, and University of Lethbridge. So Alberta, yeah, here's just a topographic map, just a big picture in terms of elevation in Alberta. The Rocky Mountains there, dividing us from our province of British Columbia to the west. So Alberta has 63 million hectares in terms of total area. 20 million of that, or about 32%, is arable. Of that arable land base, 10 million of that would be an annual crop, and 3.5 million is in what we would say is hay for forage or seeded pasture. So we call that tame pasture. It's tame pasture is pasture that is seeded for grazing purposes, and we do have. We'll kind of show a little bit more detail on this in toward the end of the presentation here, but generally speaking, that 10 million acres of annual crop and the 3.5 million acres of hay and seeded pasture, that would be privately owned. So that's mainly privately owned. And that 6.5 million acres of native pasture, a lot of that is public owned. So probably about 85% of that natural pasture. So these are areas that are like all of our land, for agriculture, as is the case anywhere in the world. It's multi-use. It's used for energy and mining and tourism, but particularly that natural pasture area is, those areas that are used, in some cases, predominantly for energy and mining, or even for, those natural landscapes for tourism and wildlife purposes. But we have grazing on those areas, and it's important in terms of it supporting the livestock herd that we have. We also have 650,000 roughly hectares of irrigation in Alberta. That's just about 6% of our cropped area, and most of that is down in the southern part of the province. There's and as we'll explain a little bit earlier, that obviously that southern area of the province is it's a bit warmer, and we have soils that are suitable to irrigation. And the amazing thing is that and you can kind of see, I don't have pointer control, but you can see the major those major rivers that come out of the mountains in southern Alberta, and we capture that water. A lot of incredible development for irrigation that has maybe been a major public investment over the last 100 years. So irrigation is extremely important for crop production. I think it's somewhere around 15 to 20% of the crop production is on that 5.6% of our area. So here's a kind of a breakdown of that cultivated land use. And so cereal grains, and I haven't split this out, but it's crops like wheat, barley would be the two major cereal crops that we grow. We grow a variety of wheats, spring wheats, kind of our typical bread wheats, or what we would just think of as a spring wheat, durum wheat for pasta, two important ones, and a lot of barley. We grow a lot of barley, a little bit of corn. We're kind of seeing corn as a growing opportunity on the prairies with some of the short season corns, but mainly that's what we would consider our C3 cereals, our cool season cereals. Oilseed crops, you would have heard the importance of canola probably on Monday. Most of that 2.5 million hectares of production is canola. There's also some flax and a little bit of soybean for an oilseed. Pulse crops, again, important rotational crop. This is one that really is relatively new to us on the prairies. I mean, it wasn't a lot of pulse acreage before about the mid 90s. So kind of in the last 15 to 20 years, the pulse acreage has come up, but lentils and peas are the two big ones. And then the hay and fodder crops, we kind of talked about that. Those would be, predominantly alfalfa and alfalfa mixes, but also some tame, annual forages in there. Other field crops, things like mustard and a number of other crops. Vegetable and nursery. And that land area in Summerfell, when Wayne and I started our careers, probably about a third of the cropped area or the cultivated areas in Alberta was in Summerfell. And so this area has gone way down because of conservation farming and the ability to, manage for what we would say continuous cropping in some of our drier areas. But we still have some Summerfell, and that area, that land area that's in tame pasture, we talked about that used for grazing. So yeah, that 13 million, 13.5 million acres of cultivated land area. We have a lot of livestock in Alberta. Alberta has about somewhere around 65% of Alberta's cattle herd, and mainly beef cattle and some dairy cows that are lumped in there as well. Pig production is important here. It's our neighboring provinces of Saskatchewan and Manitoba probably have a little higher numbers of pigs. We have some sheep and goats, but it's not, we don't raise a lot of sheep and goats. A lot of horses. And actually the horse numbers have gone down continually over the last 100 years, but we still have some horses. Other livestock, and mainly in that other livestock, it's buffalo, but there's a lot of llamas and vicuña. Like, it always amazes me just how many, we do have a few thousand llamas and vicuñas, and so you'll be interested to see that when you travel up. And of course, the poultry is here as well. So I'm gonna kind of shift gears now and talk about our prairie soils. Wayne, I think I'll just kind of keep moving forward. I mean, we could always break for questions at some point, but do you want me to I'll just continue?
Yep, no, I don't see any hands yet, so you're doing fine. Thanks, Rob.
Okay, yeah. So our prairie soils are very young soils compared to what you'll be used to in most of South America. And these soils have been reworked by successive glaciations over what we would say the past 2 million years, so that Quaternary period. And let me hit the right button. Sorry about that, folks. So our last glaciation would have ended about 10 to 12,000 years ago. So these soils, again, are really infant compared to most South American soils that are several million years old at least. Now, let's maybe try this to see, Brian, I think if we can get that short little clip here on glacier environment to play here. Let's try it. I don't have control, I think, to do that, but this is about a 4-minute clip. Let's have a listen. So it's that first one as you scroll down there, that first, just down on that screen, you'll see that first little clip. Yeah, that one right there. Yeah. Now you'll have to start that, I think.
Yeah, I was going to say I'm going to have to unshare so I can get the sound.
Oh, I've got a big note on my computer that makes sure when I shared screen that I put sound on. I always forget that too, but.
We're in the Canadian Rocky Mountains here, standing in front of the Athabasca Glacier. Stephanie, do you want to describe what scene is behind us here?
Yeah, this is a really good example of the forces that shape the Rockies Mountain. The glacier we see behind us is the Athabasca Glacier. It flows down from the Columbia ice field that lays on the plateau on top. And this type of glacier has been shaping the Rocky Mountains for the past 2 million years. Even though these mountains were formed over 120 million years ago, their current shape was really formed during the last glaciation, that's called the Pleistocene, in the last 2 million years.
So, lest someone think that glaciers only occur in mountains, maybe you should sort of expand a little bit and give us the global significance of glaciation.
That's right. During the Pleistocene, about 27% of the land masses of the world were covered by ice. So we had ice sheets in the mountains. The one in the Rockies was called the Cordilleran ice sheet. That just means the ice sheet in the mountain ranges. In the flatter part of Canada, we had what is called the Laurentide ice sheet, and that originated near Hudson Bay and covered pretty much the entire continent of North America, except for the southern parts of the US. Northern Europe was also covered by ice all the way down to the southern tip of Britain. New Zealand was completely covered by ice at that time. There was ice in the southern tip of South America. It was a very global phenomenon.
But how do we know all this?
Well, it wasn't easy to piece together, actually. But in the first third of the 19th century, people started to think about that sort of thing. And a Swiss engineer, his name was Venetz, presented the first theory or well-made argument about this phenomenon. And the person who really put it together in my mind is a person named Louis Agassiz. He did his studies in the Alps and in Northern Europe and deducted that there was really widespread glaciation that's happened over there, and then traveled to North America and Canada and made the same deductions by observing the same sort of glacial features. One of the really big ancient glacial lakes in central Canada, Lake Agassiz, is named after him.
Right, so a very important connection between the study of glaciers and landforms in Europe and in North America. How do we put this picture together in terms of timelines? When did all this happen?
It's pretty complicated. The Ice Age was not just one continuous cold period. There was glacial advances and retreats, and it makes a really complex pattern. But the broad lines are that during the Pleistocene, the weather was cooler than now, and there was a great ice age. People now think that the glacial maximum, the maximum advance of the glaciers and the ice sheets, was around 25,000 years ago. At that time, these entire valleys would be completely filled by ice, and only the highest peak would protrude over the ice, and that gives them a really pointed and sharp appearance. Around 10,000 years ago, the ice retreats, and we start getting a lot of these glacial outwash deposits forming. There was also the Little Ice Age of Europe that started around maybe the 12th or 13th century and lasted all the way until probably 1850s. And during this Little Ice Age, temperature cooled and the ice advanced again. In the 1950s, this Athabasca Glacier that's just behind us was 1.5 kilometers farther than it is now. It's still receding now, and there's evidence that it's receding faster than ever, so we'll probably see the glacier keep creeping up this valley.
Well, it's a very complex and very interesting story, and the evidence is written on the landscape all around us through much of the earth, and thanks very much for explaining some of the background.
Thank you very much for sharing that. We won't bother with that next little clip I was going to do in a few minutes. I'll just kind of explain that. Do I have screen control again here? Brian? That I thought that was such an interesting little kind of description for us on kind of that whole process of glaciation, that it was with the time we had. Just looking to see if I have screen control here.
You should have it now.
Okay. I will watch for that. So it is not showing up here. Remind me, was there something I did last time to, or did it just show up?
No, it just showed up.
Mhm. So aha, we got it. Thank you. Sorry about that. So this next slide then just really kind of summarizes that extent of that last ice age. And then this other next slide that has come on just kind of shows the progression of that. We won't bother showing that little YouTube clip, really what that YouTube clip the next one we would have watched. It would really just kind of show us the advance of that ice, and then the extent, and then you can kind of see how that ice has retreated back into what we call the Canadian Shield area, in up in toward what the Hudson Bay, which is that body of water that you can see kind of in the upper right hand corner of Canada there. So basically, the message here really was just how important that glaciation was in terms of shaping the soils that we have. So the soil parent material. So and I think I'm using terms here, but that word parent material is just something that I think you'll be familiar with. But generally, what for soils in more tropical regions, I mean, those soils may have developed on bedrock or volcanic material, whatever ash or material. But in terms of the parent material, then we're just talking about the base material that our soils developed on. And we have the glacial till. And basically, this is that material that as the glaciers were advancing across the landmass, which we would say is the prairie provinces, it's basically grinding up the residual material that was there. And again, recognizing that we've had, 2 or 3 major ice flows across the prairies over the last couple of million years. But essentially what it does is it just kind of, brings everything back to, to a base in terms of the glacial till. The fluvial or stream deposited materials would be just those forces of water movement as the glaciers are retreating and shaping those soils. We have the glacial till, we have the fluvial, we have lake deposited materials as well. So those areas where often the fluvial or stream deposited and lacustrine or lake deposited, they're kind of a mixture out there. We have some of our biggest sort of glacial lake areas are down in Ontario and in central Saskatchewan, in that area around Regina, and we'll kind of show a picture of that here in a bit. And then we have those soils that were developed on wind deposited material. So typically, those would be the sands and silts that have deposited by wind. We'll show some examples of this in a minute. And then we have the residual bedrock, which in areas where that area at, during glaciation was kind of left bare. And so often our residual bedrock is quite, those materials are quite sodic or saline, because if you go back, a few million years further back, this was a major inland sea across the prairies. And so we have this salty, salty material that underlies most of our soils that were shaped by glaciers. So this just is a soil texture map of the province of Alberta, and you can kind of see I've basically magnified the legend here, but we've got our kind of, you can see our fine materials, heavier clay materials in some of these areas where we have these glacial lakes. You have this mosaic. Most of our soils would be medium, kind of more of a glacial till type material, kind of, maybe slow moving water or even actual glacial till. And those would be kind of our medium. And then we've got these moderately coarse and very coarse areas that were wind deposited, where you've got, very, very fine, very, very coarse material. And this next slide really just kind of zooms in on the southern kind of third of the province, which is of course, Wayne and I are down here in Lethbridge, and this is the heart of our irrigated area, but you can kind of then see, those areas in terms of the mosaic of textures, the mosaic of soils that we have within that arable land base in Southern Alberta. Now, here's some examples of water-laid material. So you kind of see this kind of typical, and this would be more fast-moving water, where we've got these gravelly soils. Wind deposited parent material, so our sandy or coarser textured soils. And then, we talked about the residual bedrock. So these are areas where we don't have any of that glacial material deposited on top of these bedrock materials. And one of the things that's important to understand about our soils on the prairies is the mineralogy, and in particular, as we said, that those it really reflects that material that was ground up as the glaciers advanced, and as the glaciers retreated, then there was that material that was left, but it was really sorted by the meltwaters and the wind. And so we end up with most of our soils would be a fairly good mixture of sand, silt, and clay. And I think you'd be familiar with that from your soils down in South America. And our clay sized fractions are kind of unique, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that, because it kind of determines the characteristics of our soils, because our soils are a lot less weathered than the soils that you would experience in other, with older soils in the world. So those clay sized fractions would be secondary hydrated aluminosilicates. And it's advancing very slowly, but I think we're clay mineralogy. There we go. There it is. So the ratio of the various clay minerals that we have is going to affect the charge of the soil, the ability to hold cations, and in general, how they interact with water, and sort of the stickiness and the shrinks swell tendency of our soils. And so Prairie soils, this is the one thing that when I was, working with my friends down in Brazil, they were a little shocked when they came up here to see how sticky our soils are and how gummy they are compared to what they had experienced down there. And I don't know if you have some really sticky or gummy soils, down in South America, but they were a little, shocked or taken aback at some of our soils. And it has to do with the clay mineralogy and just that lack of weathering that we have. The other aspect of this is that our soils have a really high cation exchange capacity. And our CAC, or our cation exchange capacity, would typically be in the range of sort of 12 to 35. And when I was down in Brazil, most of the soils had a cation exchange in the range of 1 to 3. And so that does really quite dramatically affect the fertility of the soils, of course. Our soils here are very rich in available potassium. Those younger clays have a lot of potassium. And we do have a fairly bountiful supply of phosphorus, but really it's only really a small trickle that's available to plants as phosphate. So most farmers would consider, with their soils to be, relatively well supplied for potassium. And so we don't actually apply a lot of potash fertilizer in our systems, but we do apply and need a lot of phosphorus fertilizer or phosphate fertilizer because, a lot of it is tied up. We also have relatively good supplies of micronutrients and compared to some of the older soils. So very seldom do you see responses to micronutrients in our crop production systems. But as we get further along in terms of years of cropping and exporting crops, we're starting to use more micronutrients in our systems. And this would be, again, more characteristic of the prairies than it would be of some of our soils in the eastern part of Canada would have much less. And organic matter and pH is variable in our soils. So those factors affecting soil development, obviously we've talked about the parent material, but climate is the big driver, and we'll just touch on that briefly. And then of course the flora and the fauna, the organisms that we have that have been developing on these soils over the last 10 to 12,000 years since the last glaciation. And then the topography or the relief, things like slope and aspect. And the big one, of course, is time. So in terms of our climate, if you look at this graph for this map on the left-hand side of your screen, there is, you look at where we have the warmer regions of the prairies, and we're kind of right in the middle of that down in Southern Alberta and Lethbridge, and a lot of that, because that's a temperature normal on a annual basis, that ours is a little bit skewed in favor of the very warm winters that we have because of what we call our Chinook winds or faunal winds, which warm the southwest part of the prairies a bit more than the central part of the prairies. Central part of the prairies would be more of a classic continental climate, and in the southwest prairies we have these Chinooks that really moderate our temperatures in the winter. And even today, we've got winds of 30 to 50 kilometers, and the temperatures up in that 10 to 12 degree range. In fact, I played tennis this morning. So, and you look at, you kind of where those those areas of heat, and then in terms of moisture, that warmer area is also the driest area of the prairies. So that's impacting in terms of soil development, obviously, over time. So we see that in terms of the ecological zones that we have in the prairies. And here's our kind of our ecological zone, which we would describe as the prairie, and where most of our arable land is. But we do also have a fair bit of arable land in what we would call our boreal plains, which is our areas that are predominantly forested. So those would be, important areas as well for crop production and especially for grazing. But we'll the prairie area would be, soils that have developed under more of grasslands, and we'll kind of show the soil zones which kind of correspond to that area. So you've got your, our browns, our dark browns, and our blacks up in the Edmonton area, and then our dark gray and gray soil types in the province. And we'll show some examples of these soils here now. So in terms of the effects of that vegetation acting on that parent material over time, is that the soils that developed under grasslands are predominantly, and I guess we would say soils parent material that was non-saline. Those areas are Chernozems. The areas that developed under more of a forest cover rather, would be our gray luvisols. And then our soils which are kind of in, a little less developed, our younger soils, we would describe as rigosols or brunosols. And so that's kind of the big picture in terms of the effect of the flora and fauna. So here's our soil order map of Canada, and I'm going to skip over this a little bit, but just to say that our Chernozemic soils here, luvisolic soils are the kind of that gold color. So there's our prairies, and you'll see some of the red and darker kind of golden color interspersed in here. But those are areas where we've got some solanetic and vertisols as well. But we'll talk a bit more in depth about these now. Show some examples of those soils. Here's our organic matter contents in Alberta, and you can kind of see we have these black soils. We get up to 6 to 8% organic matter, and that drops down to about 2 to 4% down in the brown soils of Southern Alberta, the drier regions, soils that developed under grassland. Here's the another map showing the great group, so you can kind of see that progression from the drier, warmer areas of the brown soils in your lower right hand, in the southeast corner, right up to the black soils around Edmonton. And then our dark grays, which would be kind of mixtures of black and luvisolic, and then our luvisolic soils in the lighter gray area of the province. We have an area up in the upper left-hand corner, if you're up visiting Alberta, the Peace River region of Alberta, that is important for agriculture. We don't ignore that when we're talking about the province, because it's an important area, but it is an area that's a bit further north. And even though sometimes the growing season is a little shorter up in this region, but because it is so far north in Alberta, they get more sunlight. The sun hardly goes down, on June 21st, basically they get, around 20 hours of sunlight. And of course, as you go further north, that would be the case in the temperate regions. So I think you'd be familiar with, and most of our soils have these distinct horizons, and you'll see a few photos here. And we're looking back at some of these slides. It talks about the subdivisions for our A horizon, which would be more of our topsoil, B horizon, our subsoil. And some of these subdivisions, things like H is the nomenclature we use for humus. T would be kind of clay enrichment. E for alluviated, some of that clay that's partially leached. N would be higher in sodium. And then down in our parent material here, we would have the Ca, which is our carbonates. Our subsoils are very, very high in carbonates because of the parent material that we have in our soils. some examples now of, and again, these would be grassland soils that developed on non-saline environments where you have these chernozem, so a black chernozem on the left and a dark brown chernozem on the right. And here's more of a close-up of a dark chernozem where we would have that organic matter rich AH horizon. We've got the B horizon, which is the transition zone, and the C horizon, which is kind of below. That would have been the zone that was below most of the influence of the native vegetation that would have been there for the, last 10,000 years. And we have this next slide is a black chernozem, so you can kind of see that, 6-7% organic matter in the AH, and the B horizon, and again similar down into the undifferentiated parent material below. So soils, as we mentioned before, that developed under forest cover, we would describe as gray luva soils, and these soils are quite different. And under that forest litter, you have this what we call an LFH layer. It's an organic litter, and that organic litter tends to shape the topsoil layer underneath. So instead of having that kind of typical kind of black that we would see in our chernozems developed under grassland, we have this what we call an AE horizon. In this case, some of the clay has been moved down into this B horizon, so we have an enrichment of clay here, and this would be more kind of your silty materials here. And these soils can be productive for agriculture, but generally not as forgiving for production as. So we clear the forest off these areas, and we often have, good rainfall patterns for these soils, but they tend to be a little less productive for crop production. I mentioned about that big glacial lake that was in Saskatchewan here that kind of extended. The big one was down in an area called Regina in southern Saskatchewan. We have these vertisolic soils, which are quite unique soils. We have an area of vertisolic soils in Alberta as well, but we tend not to see this as much. These are soils with greater than 60% clay and with a swelling clay mineral. So it's a 2-to-1 smectitic clay. And you see often when they start to dry out, you see these big crevasses in the soil. And because of that, it causes a long-term churning and mixing in the soil. So you don't really see the same kind of degree of profile development, because over time these soils just kind of mix. These are tough soils. They're very productive soils if you know how to farm them right, but most of these soils are under crop production, and they can store a lot of water. And we do have a bit more of this in Saskatchewan than we do in Alberta. And of course, we have some of the waterlogged, in our waterlogged soils, we would describe as glaciolic soils. You can kind of see just an example of this. I'm going to skip over a few of these a little bit here, but this would be an example of a rigasol. This is a soil under development. This is in transition from a rigasol under grassland to a chernozem. And you can kind of see this described here as if we've already developed that A horizon, but we don't have much of a B horizon yet. So that just is when we talk about, you hear the name a rigo chernozem, that would be an example. We do have salt affected prairie soils, and again, because our soils developed on glacial till, but it was over top of that very saline basin, which was an ancient sea. Some of our soils are high in soluble salts. Some of our soils are sodic. They may have high salt, but they certainly have high sodium, and that influences the soils. And so we do have a significant area of sodic soils. Saline soils, I'm going to, in the interest of time, skip over this a little bit, but just the kind of the classic example of why we have these saline soils. it's we've got this underlying bedrock kind of, which is a very slowly permeable layer down close to the surface, very little parent material laid over top of this. We get water that's going through a permeable layer, picking up salts, and then those areas that accumulate some salt in these low-lying areas. So we, part of my career, I spent working with farmers in terms of trying to reclaim some of these areas, and a lot of the remedies for this was just to do a better job of using this excess water in the uplands, because as we moved some of those landscapes from native cover and native vegetation to cropland, we just weren't having a sufficient intensity of water use, and some of that water was ending up in these low areas and causing salt issues. I'm going to skip over this slide and talk about the other kind of salt affected soil that we mentioned was solanetic or sodic soils, in this case an example of the solanetic soil. And these soils can be, depending on the level of sodicity and where that sodicity occurs. Here in this particular soil, we have some sodium that's occurring in this transition from the AB to a BNT. So this is a black solanetic soil. And this next slide just kind of shows that when we pull away that topsoil, you can see kind of those nice sodic material that lays down at about in this case, this was down at about a 15 to 20 centimeter depth. And that area is high in sodium, and the sodium causes the soil particles to repel one another. And so it just makes it very, very difficult for root penetration. And so these soils tend not to be as productive as our Chernozems, but we do have this on this next slide, some fairly significant areas in Alberta where these solanetic soils occur. And so in that darker color in this particular slide would be about 30% of the soils would be solanetic in that area. So it is something that we have to deal with. And there are some management practices that farmers have adopted to try and farm those areas. But to be real honest, a lot of those areas are just left in forages or native vegetation, because that's sometimes the best land use. Soil acidification, we do have some soils that are that are acid. And when we talk about acid soils, we would be talking about soils that are below a pH of about 5.5. So nothing like what you'd experience in that Cerrado region where the soils were down in pHs of 2, for example, unless they were limed. So we do have some natural acidity, and what we're finding is that this next point up here is that we are seeing a kind of a slow and steady acidification of our soils, and it's we're anticipating having to put more lime on in the future, and it's really just because we're using our ammonium-based fertilizers to such an extent, and we can kind of almost predict based on the composition of the soil and how much fertilizer we use about how long we've got until we start dropping, our pHs start dropping below 4.5 to 5.5, which is happening in some areas, unfortunately. So just to kind of wrap up land suitability rating, and we've kind of talked about land suitability with respect to the soil types as we've gone, but just so you're aware that we do have a really great system in Canada to rank the soils and landscapes for their suitability for crop production. It's a Canada-wide system, and it relates to the type of crops that you might want to grow. And we'll kind of use an example of that here. So there's kind of two components. It rates it in terms of a class, and it's classes from 1 to 7. And so it's just basically relative production for specified crops or crops. And it's the limitations then under those subclasses are things like climate. You know, I mean, is it too dry? You know, is it going to be too wet, too cold for a particular crop? And then it ranks it, of course, for some of the soil types that we showed. You know, obviously those solanetic soils, or those areas that would be livestock soils, might have, you know, be downgraded just because of the fact that, you know, they have limitations in terms of the what can be grown. And then, of course, landscape features as well. This would be the precipitation levels that kind of undergird and drive the suitabilities in Alberta. And you can kind of see, again, we, you know, our drier areas down in the south with, you know, less than 350 millimeters of precipitation, right, you know, up to the areas where we have our black soils, where we're up to, you know, 450 to 500 millimeters of precip on an annual basis. And then, of course, temperature would be the other big driver. And here's our frost-free days. So again, we have, you know, our drier region down in the south. We have, you know, upwards of, you know, probably about 130 frost-free days to grow crops. But it's on the drier side, but that's where we have our irrigation. So we have the flexibility to grow some of those, you know, crops under irrigation where we can get the water to it, and we have the growing season. So most of our irrigation is kind of concentrated down in this this area where we have I think the next slide would be growing degree days. Yes, growing degree days. So
I'm still not sure about that.
So Siri is telling me that I'm just about out an hour, Wayne. So I'll try to wrap this up, but we're getting close to the finish line here, folks. So growing degree days. So here in the south, in that 1400 to 1600 growing degree days, and these are GDD over 5 Celsius. And you can kind of see, you know, as we move up in this area in the Peace region is only 1100 to 1200, but it's still an important area of crop production in Alberta because we have those longer daylight, you know, and we're getting 20 hours of sunlight, whereas we're only getting maybe 16, 17 hours of sunlight at, you know, on June 21st down in the southern part of the province. So just an example of land suitability for spring cereals. And this would be, you'll notice that there's no dark green, there's no number ones, and it's a Canada-wide system. So really the best we can do in Alberta is our, you know, kind of our number twos here. So our lighter greens. And a lot of those areas, remember we said about the solanetic soil. So a lot of our poorer land suitabilities would be related to soil condition and the dry conditions that we have in the southern part of the province. Just one more example, and this would be the one specific to canola production. And again, we don't have any class 1s. There's some class 1s down in Ontario and Quebec for canola, but in Western Canada, again, you can kind of see those classes that reflect the moisture pattern and our soil types on the prairies. So just wrapping up by relating that back now to the type of class, the typical type of yields that we would have. And again, these are a far cry from some of the yields that you can achieve for crops like, you know, corn or even, you know, wheat and beans down in the areas that I travel in Brazil. But in in those drier areas in our class 4-5 soils, you know, we would be kind of averaging about 2 tons per hectare of wheat. When we get up into our better class soils, up to 4, and irrigation, we would be 7. You can kind of see the numbers, barley, you know, kind of similar to wheat. Canola, you know, excellent productivity for canola once we get into class 2 and 3 and the irrigation. Pea, we don't grow a lot of pea under irrigation. Lentils are only grown in the drier areas of Western Canada, so we only grow those down in the south. And alfalfa hay, again, you know, we don't see a lot of alfalfa or mixed hay grown down in the driest areas of the province because the yields are just, you know, not great. but we do have a lot of forage production in those wetter areas and where there are better soils. And then again on irrigation, and just put on through on potato there as a reference as well. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that pretty much wraps things up here. We did have our driest year in, I think, maybe 30 or 35 or 40 years since the 1980s last year. And we're hoping for better things this year. And with that, Wayne, I will turn it back to you.
Well, that's great, Rob. Thank you so much. You've covered a tremendous amount of material here, so I'm sure there's some questions. I know Tulio raised his hand earlier, and he asked about what really causes the salinity or the acidity, and wondering if it's related to organic matter or something else in particular. When you mentioned that the acidity of our soils seems to be increasing, because that is a global issue on a lot of older soils, and it hasn't been a big problem. Some people say it's fertilizer and so on, but you have any opinion on that, Rob, about what causes that acidity?
Yes, and so again, where we're seeing that happening is in soils that are starting at, sort of, a pH of about 7 or less. We're seeing this gradual decline. And, I think if we maintain those soils in a perennial land, in a perennial cover with perennial forages, because of the significant contribution that legumes, particularly alfalfa and clovers, can make, that probably we wouldn't see that decline as quickly, but we see it much more in our annual cropping systems, and we think and are, I think, convinced really that it's because of our use of ammonia-based fertilizers. And some work that's been done at in Montana at the University of Bozeman, Montana State University of Montana, has kind of tracked that in some of their soils as well, where they've kind of gone back in and looked at fertilizer use in their case in soils that started at about a pH of about 5.9 or 6, and they've tracked the influence of nitrogen fertilizer. So that's a big one. The other kind of complication is that because we've moved to no-till, we haven't been mixing these soils to the extent that we did in the first probably 60 to 70 years of farming. So we've done two things. We've kind of stopped tilling and stopped mixing those horizons, and then we've been able to do that because we're not mining out the organic matter, we're applying fertilizer. So the two things have kind of happened in concert. And so it is certainly, some farmers are posing the question to us agronomists, is saying, do we need to go in and moldboard plow and flip over our soils once every 15 or 20 or 25 years to try and bring up some of those inherent carbonates that are in the deeper down in the soil. And it's something that we're not convinced that that's the right solution, but we're looking at practices like liming which is very expensive to try and perhaps prevent the need from going in and doing extensive tillage. But thank you for the question.
You could close your presentation now. Maybe we can open it up for questions so we can see more of the faces of our participants. So, any other questions for Rob?
I have one for Rob, but I see Tulio's got his hand up, so go ahead, Tulio.
So you told us about the no tillage system in Canada. Is it very common? Because the organic materials are already high. So is it common or is it a punctual thing?
Yeah, yeah, that's right, you know. So we would be on the prairies, we're somewhere around 70% no-till. 70% of the annually seeded crop area is about no-till. Down in that area where I am in Southern Alberta, in the dry area, it's probably more like about 85 to 90% no-till. And the biggest motivator has been water conservation as opposed to organic matter sequestration or carbon sequestration. And so, as you say, because of wind and water erosion, and for moisture conservation. And now we've benefited all of the kind of soil health benefits that have kind of been a bonus in a sense. It's been a bonus where we've seen, yes, some increase in organic matter, but probably more importantly, what we're seeing there, Tulio, is the improvement in things like water infiltration and aggregate stability have improved over time.
Rick, you have a question?
Yeah, related. Perhaps Rob, could you explain? Rob, is he still here? I don't see him.
Yeah, he dropped down on the thing. It's breaking up a little bit, I guess, maybe because we got more videos going, but Rob is, he's in slow motion right now, so I'm not sure.
Well, basically, I wanted to ask him if he could explain for everybody.
Yeah, it's, I think like I mentioned, I'll turn.
Like we've lost Rob there.
He's showing connected, but I don't.
Rick, I just, my system was cutting out just when you were starting the question to explain. And so if you could start that again, I turned my video off, see if that helps with.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Yeah, I would appreciate it if you could you've kind of partially covered it, but if you could explain the concept of summer fallow, why that was a common practice for probably 40, 50 years, and then we've evolved to reduce tillage, zero tillage, that sort of thing. The impact that's had, one, on the soil and our ability to grow crops, and how farmers have adjusted as a result. I don't know if that's clear or not, but that's summer fallow.
Yes. So in the probably the first, up until, let's kind of pick a, it was probably up until about 1980, almost all farmers on the prairies would have used summer fallow at least once every 3 years. And they were using it for a combination of trying to get caught up on weeds, trying to, sort of increase the, I guess basically they're trying to improve the fertility of the soil. So you're kind of, breaking down some of the inherent organic matter that was in the soil. So we were kind of mining the soils during that period of time. And then moisture conservation. So we were conserving moisture, in that summer fallow for that next crop. And we didn't have, so really it was, once we started getting seeding systems that allowed us to go in and plant on an annual basis. And once we had herbicides that could help us tackle the weeds, and once we got our head around the use of fertilizers, to rather than trying to mine our soils, that we started recropping, and it. So I think there was a period of time, probably over about 40 or 50 or 60 years on the prairies, where where summer fallow was a common practice. It was degrading the soils because we were mining organic matter. Those lands were susceptible to soil erosion, wind and water. We talked about saline soils, so there was water that was escaping, getting down into the subsoil and causing issues with salinity. So there was a number of negative things that were happening. And I think that people like Wayne Lindwall and other scientists were basically saying that, look, we need to move more toward continuous cropping. And that practice started to take off in the 80s. And again, it's very hard to find summer fallow anymore on the prairies. You have to drive a long ways to find it because it just isn't a practice that's used. And what we've seen is an improvement in organic matter. We've seen a dramatic reduction in erosion. And of course, the amount of crop that we're producing right now in that prairie region has quadrupled basically since the late 1980s because of that.
So basically, Rob, it was leaving the land idle for
Yes.
one season or one every 3 years.
That's right. Yeah. Just going in and cultivating an appropriate amount to kind of control the weeds. And then again, yeah, it was, I think there was this idea that our forefathers had that it was giving the land a rest. But I think we all know in terms of that the soil really isn't enjoying that rest. The soil organisms aren't enjoying that rest. So we saw, a deterioration in soil quality because of that practice. And our soils have literally been transformed over that past kind of generation now that have continuous crop the land.
Any other questions? Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Rob.
Rick was stealing a little bit of my thunder and Rob there, since I'll be covering the summer fallow issue extensively in a few weeks. In fact, I'll be sending a book. I was asked to write a book about the history of why all this happened. And so I'll be sharing the book that a colleague and I wrote 8 or 10 years ago about summarizing the reasons why there's been a change in the landscape on the prairies. And so we'll be sharing that with all the participants as well, but I'll go through some of the history on the summer fallow issue. But as Rob indicated, with the summer fallow, we had over 10 million acres of summer fallow for 60 years of farming in the prairies. And as a consequence, we lost about 35% of the organic matter because of erosion and wind and water erosion primarily, but also the oxidation of that organic matter. So it was great because farmers didn't have to add any fertilizer because they were breaking down that inherent organic matter from our grassland soils. So they were getting good yields for several years because that organic matter was decomposing into nitrogen and phosphorus. And so they were getting great yields for a while until that good organic matter disappeared through erosion. And then they were starting to realize how come yields are going down. But we'll go through some of that in a few weeks in a little more detail. I see Maria's got her hand up.
Yes, hi. I have 2 questions. Well, are the crops you mentioned are transgenic? If they were, what percentage of transgenic crops is used in Canada? And if they cause some change in the ground, or I don't know, something like that.
Yes, so we don't grow a lot of corn and soybeans on the prairies, but there are, in Eastern Canada, there's a lot of corn and soybeans, and they're predominantly all transgenic. So they would be mostly transgenic. Our canolas are about, I'd say about 80 or 90% of our canola production. So if you remember, the amount of oilseed would be transgenic. And none of our cereals, I don't think any of our cereals would be transgenic. We've got a hybrid rye, but it's not transgenic. So no, we don't have none of our cereal production and none of our the pulse production that would be like lentil and pea, so pulse grains that are consumed as human food or livestock feed. None of those would be transgenic. So it's the canolas, corn, and then the soybean that's used, soybean for oil, which is again on the prairies. That's corn and soybean are kind of a minor crop, but they're almost all. It's hard to find a non-transgenic corn anymore. So.
Another question, Maria?
Yes, you mentioned that water is conserved. How is the water conserved? Do you use an irrigation system, or I don't know, how do you conserve the water?
Well, in the southern part of the province, we've got, our wettest area of Alberta would be the Rocky Mountain area, Rocky Mountains to the west. We get a lot of, snow and rain. And so particularly that snowpack in the winter, we capture that in a series of reservoirs. So in the big picture sense of conservation, that water is captured as opposed to conserved, and then it's distributed out through an irrigation canal system network. A lot of it is big main canals that come out from those reservoirs, and then a lot of it is then piped underground into the communities and to the farms. So it's fairly efficient from that point of view. So that's the big picture in terms of as it relates to irrigation. The irrigation systems that they use are their systems that are relatively efficient. They're low to the ground and they're trying to reduce evaporation losses. But some farmers are going, I guess if you had to look maybe 20 years down the road, I don't know, we're seeing some people showing interest in, putting the irrigation underground, with, subsurface drip and some of those technologies. But right now we have the luxury of having a fairly bountiful supply of water relative to the area that we irrigate. And so we're, there isn't big incentives to drive efficiency to the extent that there would in, say, areas like California in the US, or places where they are just so desperately short of water, surface water, that they're moving toward very, very efficient systems. So that's kind of the big picture in terms of irrigation. And then of course we're trying to, like, the biggest reservoir that we have, I think, everywhere in terms of for agricultural production would be our soil, our soil. And so we try and optimize the amount of water that we can capture in our soil by keeping, our stubble as tall as possible through the winter months to catch snow. And we try and use practices that conserve that water into the growing season. We're planting into areas and trying to keep stubble as tall as possible to reduce evaporation, and trying to conserve the little bit of water that we have for our dryland systems, and that has been a remarkable success, in our environment, in our area of the world. And I know that those same practices are being used around the world right now. And we've learned from Argentina, in that regard. And we've learned from really even Brazil in terms of some of the practices and innovations that farmers have made to no-till and to conserve water and do those practices. So
Just building on Rob's comments and Maria's question, the reason we spend so much time talking about soils and the soil profile is I always sort of suggest to farmers that we have to know our roots. And the roots of crops go down to 1.5 meters, grow 1.5 meters in the soil, 1.5 meters deep. And the roots of alfalfa perennials can go down to 10 meters deep. So you can imagine how important that soil depth and topsoil is for holding that water. Our goal every year is to try to conserve 100 millimeters of water in the top meter of the soil, 100 millimeters of water before we even plant the seed. So that's our objective. And if we can do that by not plowing, by not cultivating, then that crop has got a good start. It's already got 100 millimeters of water sitting there ready for the roots to utilize. So we have to know our roots, and that's very critical for growing a sustainable crop in Southern Alberta. Brady, you have a question.
Hi there. I don't have a question, but Rob, this is just for you. I thank you for your presentation, and I really enjoy being reminded how young Southern Alberta's soils are in comparison with other places. But this is more for the rest of the group. Unfortunately, I'm committed elsewhere, and so I have to take off now. But it was good to see you all again, and I look forward to seeing you all come this Friday. So I have to take off early. I apologize for that, but until next time.
Thanks, Brady. See you.
Thanks, Brady. Any final question?
I wonder, Wayne, if I could put Philippe on the spot, because he shared a direct message with me earlier about something he learned in university and today about soil. So Philippe, are you prepared to share with everybody what you shared with me, what you learned this afternoon, and how it may compare?
Well, you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay, today I have my first class of soil in my university. And in use, I learned the laws, the kind of soil, the colors, the age, and how this is formation with the pass of the years. And my professors say the same, that it's time, the most important of all of them. We have the physics, the biology, the chemic, but obviously the time. It's just time to give to the soil the age and the capacity to you can grow some different kinds of what is the word, plants, some kind of different. That word is what I'm looking for.
Well said.
So I'm very excited with this presentation. I'm sorry for arriving late, but I was come back from my university to my home. So thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Philippe.
Last question, Victor.
Rob, thank you for your presentation. I had a question. After the winter time, do you have a specific management to prepare the soil for the next crop? Because here in Brazil, we have some problems with the acidification of our soils and those things. And we need to work with lime and other fertilizers to correct our soils. How it works in Alberta?
Yeah. So, and I saw that when I was down in Brazil, like you say, with the lime, there was we lime very infrequently here, and I'm doing some research with some of the farmers that I work with to try lime, but we think we might have to apply lime once every 15 to 25 years in our systems. And, you're probably doing it way more frequently there because of the types of soils that you have. But really, in terms of our, how that would look for most of our, say, farmers that are in what we would call annual crop production, how the spring looks, is that they'll be watching soil temperatures right now, and they'll have their fertilizer, that very expensive fertilizer, and they'll have their seed, they'll have everything kind of ready, and they'll be, we have this kind of short window for planting on the northern Great Plains in our temperate region, which is often, there might be as little as 15 days where it's kind of suitable for planting, and that will typically happen between about the 20th of April and about the 20th of May. They'll look for the, there'll be about 15 days, and they'll be applying fertilizer at the time that they seed, usually in a separate row with their machine. And most often, they're not using tillage ahead of that. So they're going out and applying a herbicide, a glyphosate herbicide, or combinations of different herbicides to control the weeds that might have germinated through the fall, winter, early spring. And so they're getting that crop off to a clean start. And it's like a race to harvest. So we get that crop planted on, say, sometime between the, say 25th of April to the 25th of May. We're already starting harvest by sometimes the 15th, say 10th of August or 15th of August. And maybe we might be finished some years by September 15th. And so it's like this race, and that's the biggest thing that people are shocked about when they come up into our part of the world, because in Brazil, they're planting, 365 days of the year, they're planting year round. And in places like England, there might be like a 200-day growing season. So they're planting over 2 months sometimes. And when you come here, you have these oversized machines, these big machines, for planting. Sometimes they're 15, 20 meters wide, just because there's a race to get the crop planted. and then the combines, like the incredible capacity for combines, because everything's being combined at the same time. So it's kind of a unique thing where we have a lot of capital investment because we have this race to get the crop planted, when it's just warmed up enough, but not too dry, and kind of getting that finished in that 100 to 120 degree growing season that we have, and then getting it harvested before winter comes, so. I don't know if that helps answer your question.
Well, thank you, Rob. I think we'll call an end to the session today. We've used up our allotted time. I want to thank everyone for their thoughtful questions, and especially thank you, Rob, for covering a vast amount of material, giving us things to think about, and preparing us for, the cropping session next week, where we'll get a lot more detail about the crops we grow both under dry land and irrigated. I'm sure you're all looking forward to the Friday session, where you're going to discuss what you've learned for the week. And so again, thank you all for your attention. Thank you, Brian, for your help in managing the slide presentation, and Rick as well. So hope you all have a good day.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye for now.
Bye, thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. See you on Friday.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye now.
Rick, just a moment. Vitor and Tulio has a schedule for the university. So I think both of them can come next Friday because of the university schedule. They had a technical visit outside from the city. Okay.
Could you
just so.
Jenny, could you just ask them to send a WhatsApp message to us or an email, just so that we're not looking for them and trying to track them down?
Yes, for sure. Tulio and Vitor are here. So Tulio and Vitor, could you please write in the group? Okay.
Okay, but Jenny, it will be on the next week, not this Friday. It will be on the next.
Okay, next
Okay.
Friday. So that would be
Yeah.
the 25th.
Yes, correct.
Okay, no, that would be great if you could do that.
Okay, but you can make some notes, you can write to the group, please. Okay, this is very important meeting.
Yeah,
It's
our hope is that everybody can get to every session, but we understand life happens. You've got a life
Yeah.
and a schedule, and but just let us know. Keep us in the loop.
Yes, of course, because of course they had a university schedule and they needed to follow the classes and the group just for it. But of course, they will follow the classes and the meetings. We are very committed. Okay, that's why they want to say in advance. Okay, thank you. Thank you
That's
so
great.
much.
Thank you, everyone.
Your education is
everyone.
first priority.
Yes, for sure. I'm following the
This
meetings.
is another part of education here.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a good one.